Internet. Today we're going to be talking about the current state of psychiatric nosology, and I'm going to offer my critique of our current system, at least in terms of psychiatric nosology. So what is nosology? Nosology is a way of organizing, classifying and understanding illness. I'm saying illness here because it doesn't just apply in psychiatry, but it applies to the whole medical field. However, because I'm a clinical psychologist, I know very, very little about the other aspects of medicine, but I do know psychiatric nosology, so this is what we're going to be focusing on. What you have to understand also is that the nosology we have now isn't the one we necessarily started with. We didn't start by thinking the things we now think. This is a whole process of evolution of the field, and psychiatry and psychology have a very rich and dense history of how we classified, sort of, and conceptualized mental illness. And there's been a very, very wide-ranging set of approaches, of beliefs, of thinking. However, we now have entered a certain age of psychiatry in which things have become quite different from what they used to be. So very quickly, the way they used to be 50, 60, 100 years ago was that psychiatry was organized under the idea or the assumption that we tried to understand the whole perspective of the individual. Things were much more, how can I say, rigid, but they were also more fine in the fact that the psychiatrists of 100 years ago really tried to understand the subjectivity of individuals, to really understand what was happening in the mind of the individuals. It was not just a list of symptoms that made an illness, but also the subjectivity binded by that illness. We can see that it's still relevant in psychoanalysis, let's say, in which, yes, symptoms might be important to make a diagnosis, but the lived experience, the subjectivity, what the person feels, is as important, if not more important, as one symptom, at least in psychoanalysis, can mean many, many things in how the person is experiencing the symptom. It's a distinction that has been kind of lost in current psychiatry, as current psychiatry is much more modular, meaning it's more flexible. For example, very simply, you can have a depression, a generalized anxiety, OCD. None of those diagnoses are mutually exclusive. They can even go very well with one another. So we have gone from a more rigid, structuralist point of view to a much more modular and flexible point of view. However, in that flexibility, and that is what I think has been lost, is that there has been lost a certain form of refinement. What I mean by that is that psychiatry has traded its depth for simplicity and for ease of use. And for me, that trade-off was not especially a good one. What I mean by that is that often it has led to a form of trivialization of subjective experience, and even in the worst possible way, a denial of subjective experience. For example, it's no longer about trying to understand the very core of what's happening in the mind of an individual, and it's more about seeing the objective symptoms, what is on the surface. For example, the person is gonna, for example, OCD, have rituals, have compulsive, obsessive traits, have, let's say, a form of over-emphasizing security, cleanness, and so on and so forth. But there's no tentative in the nosology to try and understand what's happening with the person. Why is it like that? How did it develop like that? What is it causing in the individual? And right now, the current answer would be it's causing the stress, and we have to treat that distress, which is completely valid, right? It does cause the stress, but does it cause anything else than distress? Does it cause security for a brief moment? Is it there because the person feels that they could be hurt? All of these very interesting questions are left aside in our current system for something that's much more, I would even go so far as to say, cold, detached. And in a way, this is what Gary Greenberg argues in his Book of Woe, is that psychiatry, current psychiatry, is really trying its hardest to become, a main branch of medicine. What I mean by that is psychiatry has always been a main branch of medicine, but it has often been ill-considered by the others because of its lack of objectivity, because of its lack of real evaluation of the subject. For example, in other branches of medicine, for example, you can order for blood tests, you can do a CT scan, an MRI, you can do ecographies. There's so many things that you can do to see. However, psychiatry, we can't really do that. Even nowadays, in which we understand the brain more precisely than we ever used to, it's still not really that good. And the same goes for for example, gut health, that's also intertwined with mental health. We're still at the premises of understanding stuff. So psychiatry has always suffered from this unfalsifiable aspect that you can't really see it. You have to go on clinical observation, and even then it's kind of dubious because it's very subjective. So in order to try and prevent that from continuing, the DSM and everything alike has really tried its hardest to go into what is the most objectifiable and objective truths. However, this perspective has also created a simplification, as if you're only gonna go for the surface level stuff, or you're only gonna get a surface level understanding of phenomena. And I think that trade-off has been honestly disastrous, because right now it has given a form of dumbing down of psychiatry. Not in the fact that the layman can understand it, that's very good, but in the fact that professionals themselves have stayed at a very superficial level of what is a mental illness. That it's just like, for example, breaking a bone or having a flu, when it's much more subtle than that. It's the whole conception of the mind of the individual which has taken a turn at certain points, which has become different. The whole phenomenology, i.e. the lived experience, subjectivity of the individual, is a form that we no longer really take into account. It's more symptom-based rather than an in-depth understanding. And I think that trade-off has caused us to lose a lot of the interesting discourse that was there beforehand. For example, people like Bingswanger really tried to understand what was happening in the minds of schizophrenic patients, in the minds of neurotic patients, in a way that I think nowadays we don't really try to do. Nowadays, generally speaking, we just try and treat the symptom, not seeing that the symptom is just one element of a whole mind that is not, it's not just like something that's on top of it and needs to be treated. It's intertwined with so many other elements of the mind, and that form of reasoning has been kind of lost. Also, I should note that the more advances we do in our understanding of the brain, the more we tend to try and go through neurological explanations, which are fine, they're interesting, they're good, but they don't change the subjectivity of the patient. What the patient is experiencing is not alleviated by the knowledge that, well, it works because your frontal lobe has been shaped differently, is being, developed in a different way, or because of this or that part of your brain that's dysfunctional, or because your amygdala, for example, if you have generalized anxiety, is dysfunctional because there has been a fundamental biological problem. People aren't really helped by that. At least what I have found is that those explanations might give a bit of relief, but they don't go to the crux of the matter. Like even if we say that about the amygdala, the question is why? Is it just because genetics and biology has done that to you? Is it because something of your experience in the world has created that? All of this refined discourse is lost in a way that's much to the detriment of psychiatry. Because I think that by trying to play catch up with the rest of medicine, it has become a disaster for psychiatry, where the richness and the depth of our understanding was really what made psychiatry, I feel, a beautiful endeavor, even though there was a lot of abuse, but the ideas behind it were wonderful, were truly something of an intellectual, even a philosophical understanding of human subjectivity. We have just become just an offshoot of medicine, and I think that we have lost a lot, and notably in our conception of humanity. Because as we go forward, humans are more and more considered as machines, that the brain is like hardware that has been corrupted or has broken down. Therefore, if we fix the hardware, everything goes. And I think there is a real danger in trivializing our subjectivities like that, of just seeing us as dysfunctional. Whereas I really do believe that symptoms show something of us and of our integration into the world that we are currently not seeing or refusing to see, because it's not as good, or it doesn't sound as scientific, or because it just doesn't have the prestige that would have other types of explanations, notably neurological, biological, or even psychological. But here I'm not talking about psychodynamics, but I'm really talking about A plus B equals C kind of logic. Whereas I do feel that our humanity implies that there is something more, something that cannot be quantified, cannot be just reduced, something that's so very fundamental to us and yet is completely denied in our system. Denied to the point where we reduce our suffering to just symptoms, whereas it's so much more than that. It's a lived experience, it's a subjective, interpersonal, relational, cultural dimensions that are not taken into account, or at least not to the real true extent of what they should. And instead of facing this difficulty, instead of trying to understand the depth, even though we might fail, and that's a real true problem, but instead of facing the difficulty to try and understand it, make something of it, we shy away from it, we reject it for something so trivial that I feel that it loses meaning. Whereas trying to understand mental health through the lens of a whole subjectivity is a hard sell, but it's really worth it, because there is meaning in that difficulty, there is meaning in our subjectivity. And that's something we are losing, and I feel that that's a real danger, as there used to be a time where psychiatrists and psychologists were also virtually philosophers, or people that used to think in this real deep, fundamental way of trying to understand. Nowadays, I have the feeling, talking with colleagues, seeing psychologists, psychiatrists, having discussions with them, that we're no longer in that. We have become mere technicians that are guided by the nosology of our time and by the complete and utter fantasy that science and the understanding of the brain will give all the answers. And I feel that this is leading us down a path where we are no longer thinkers. We are merely technicians of the brain and of the mind, and I personally am very reluctant to go down that path, as I feel that we are not gaining truth. We are superposing something we feel truth onto phenomena, but we are losing the real core depth of the phenomena. The phenomena is being simplified to an aberrant degree, whereas previously psychiatry, for all its defects, and it really had a lot of defects, really was aiming for the depths of human mind, consciousness and unconsciousness, and that has been lost. And I do feel that the understanding we now have is not as good as it used to be. And I feel that, for example, psychosis, right, has been completely trivialized by the symptoms. We no longer have things like Cotard syndrome. We no longer have things like Capgras or the subsets of schizophrenia. We only have like a broad umbrella, as if this was really a good understanding when it's not. The same goes for personality disorders. There's a lot of them that have been evacuated. And there's another big problem I feel with current psychiatry, is that because things are rare, they no longer count for anything. That because, for example, things like Cotard syndrome only affect a couple of hundred people throughout the world, we are not going to talk about it. The same goes for example, as if personalities. Too rare, so we don't talk about it. And it's even going to get worse as there's discussions to take out paranoia, schizoid, and schizotypical out of the DSM because they're too rare. And this gives us a very flawed logic in which modern psychiatry works along lines: if it's rare, then it doesn't exist, or it's trivial, so we don't need to count it. And this is appalling, because it's not because something is rare that it doesn't exist. Quite the opposite. Because it's rare, we should try and investigate it. But as I was saying earlier, there is no real effort for that, because it's hard, complicated, subjective, unfalsifiable. Disinterest, complete and utter disinterest in it. Whereas I feel that that's something we have to fight for. We have to fight for the fact that there are rare syndromes, and we have to understand them, quantify them in the fact that we have to understand that they do exist. And I think that by ejecting them from the discussion, we are going to lose so much more in terms of clinical thinking, in terms of clinical understanding, because modern psychiatry wants to play at being a mainstay in medicine. I find that appalling. We shouldn't try and be like others. We should be our own version of things. And bad luck if others or other disciplines don't feel that we are, how can I say it, like them or as good as them. Because I'm going to tell you something. It's not because we have this modern nosology that we are more respected. Quite the opposite. We have lost our depth, and people trivialize our findings and think that they can apply them even if they don't have a degree. So this is going to become a real problem, because instead of detaching and saying we are who we are, we're trying to reintegrate something that will, in a very interesting way, never integrate us properly. And also, by just forsaking the rarity, we are denying clinical reality. We are denying the truth of what we're seeing because we want to be something else. And for me, that we are completely on the wrong path in that denying the subtlety and the clinical reality of what is happening. So it's been quite a long video, and I hope you found it interesting. Of course, here I'm not saying that I have the absolute truth, quite the opposite. It's my perspective on all of this. But I wanted to talk about it because I feel that we are at a crossing point in which our knowledge is being lost, and we're not gaining anything really. And we're just pretending, and that's why I wanted to make this video, just to make it very clear that there is something beautiful in understanding the mind, even if it's something that only affects one individual out of 100,000 or 1,000,000. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It does exist, and we have to try our utmost to understand and to go in depth. We cannot rely on superficial understandings. This will be the downfall of not necessarily psychiatry, but of what we would understand as a form of humanity in psychiatry and in psychology, a form of trying to understand what is making us human. And I think that we are at risk of losing that for a more technical and superficial understanding. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have something you want to say, leave it in the comments. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.